So we're really, really happy to have back Dr. Larry McClellan. He's been with us a couple times before, always phenomenal presentations. And he talks about a very important subject with the Underground Railroad in the area. And he's just become the guy to go to for Underground Railroad stuff around here. And so we're fortunate to have him. He's got an incredible background. He's one of the founders of Governor State University. He taught there for what, 30 years, I think? Yeah. He was mayor of University Park, is that right? It goes on and on. Tons and tons of publications, very impressive stuff. And one of the most important publications is Onward to Chicago. It's Freedom Seekers and the Underground Railroad in Northeastern Illinois. He would love to autograph one of these for you tonight. They'll be available for sale after the program. And there's other publications here too. So please step up, talk with them, and buy the books afterwards.
Okay, hold it right there. Hold the book up for a minute like that. Okay.
There we go. There we go.
Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Very happy to present Dr. Larry McClellan.
Well, good evening, and thanks for the introduction and the commercial. That's terrific. We'll be glad to get the books together afterwards. And my wife Lil is with me. Wave your hand. She's my Vanna White. She will be, my lovely assistant will help you get books, and I'll be glad to sign them. Also with me tonight are two of my colleagues from the Midwest Underground Railroad Network. Tom Shepard, who I've worked with for years, and he's had some connections with this place over the years. And then Alana Lewis is in the back. And delighted to be back visiting with you again. And last November, I received a call from the folks at the Michigan Maritime Museum. And they wanted me to come and do something. And they said, could you focus on Lake Michigan? I said, well, they're in South Haven, it's right on. So I started digging into Lake Michigan stuff, and some of it was brand new to me. And then came February, and there was a huge snowstorm in South Haven, and I didn't give it. And pardon? Oh, over there? Oh, am I?
Yeah, you look like Lake Michigan.
Oh, I know. Hi, I'm Lake Michigan. So they had this huge snowstorm, which didn't do it, and very soon after that, Jim called and said, gosh, we hear you're doing something about Lake Michigan. Share it with us. And so I'm delighted to be with you and share some of the things I've found about Lake Michigan. Part of the journey with my book was really the book was a culmination of about 30 years of research. But I also clearly understood that there was a whole lot of stuff I had never gotten into. And so the book provides for me, and with Lake Michigan, the book was kind of the starting point. And so there's a lot about the lake in it, but I've now been teaching myself new stuff based on my own. And I'm really delighted to say there are a variety of folks around the country who are now taking up my basic framework and kind of digging deeper with it. So it's very satisfying. So I'm delighted to share this with you this evening, and got some things I want to share and then some stories I want to tell. Okay. Well, we'll do it by hand. Okay, technical people, it appears to be frozen.
See if the PC is frozen. PC is not frozen.
Yeah, the microphone is. Do we need to?
Okay, we're going to stop sharing. Stop sharing.
You hit to stop sharing.
No,
there you go. Okay.
And then we're going to share again. And let's go to Windows. And then we're going to go to that one, or
it's here. It's this one.
And let's see if that works now. Oh, hold on, we gotta switch over to the application. Let's minimize this.
Yeah.
There it goes.
Hey, Scott to the rescue. Yeah.
Hooray, thank you. It is amazing, and it's always, I always pray that when I go someplace, they will have a technical person that makes sure that we take care of the details.
I need your 5-year-old.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, my son at home, my son regularly takes care of things for me. So as we look at the Underground Railroad, there are two really great sets of stories. There are stories about the Underground Railroad itself and all those people that were assisting fugitive slaves, and that were very involved in this dynamic we call the Underground Railroad. And then there's a great cycle of stories about the fugitive slaves themselves. And today we refer to them as freedom seekers. And so what we have is these two great cycles. All these Underground Railroad stories, the people that helped and their locations and all that. And then there are the stories about the people that were on the journeys. And the dilemma we have is that for the last 180 years, we've told an awful lot of these stories and almost none of these. And so part of what I'm trying to do and part of what I'm sharing with you tonight is a real serious intention to kind of rebalance that. So we're seeing the full richness of this experience and this remarkable part of American history. The dilemma we have is that particularly in Illinois, for the last 180 years, almost all of Illinois history and almost all of Chicago history was written by old white guys. And most of what they wrote about was old white guys. And so we've got a real problem because they were fairly narrow in what they were seeing, and we really have to expand that vision. And so I invite you, as we think about all this, to talk about the Underground Railroad is to talk about people who escaped their enslavement, the freedom seekers, and the people that responded to them, the networks of the Underground Railroad. Now, to get at that, we really need to reframe our story. And you know what, I'm using the phrase freedom seeker. And what I want you to get a hold of, we're talking, of course, about the fugitive slaves before the Civil War. And their situation was dramatically more difficult after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. However, slave is a category of property. Right? When I do my research, I'm looking at estate sales and tax records to find where they list the horses and the pigs and the cows and the sheep and the slaves. Right? Slave is a category of property. And all of us around the country that are struggling with this have decided we will refer to folks as freedom seekers to affirm their fundamental intention as human beings, that they would be free. And so I invite you to join us in reframing this. We are not talking about property. We are talking about human beings that got enslaved by other human beings. Now, also as part of that reframing, there is this old mythology we all carry that the Underground Railroad was created by all these good abolitionists, mostly white abolitionists. And then they went down and they pulled the slaves out, and they helped the slaves, and they transported the slaves and all that. And that's really inaccurate, because the heart of all this were the journeys of freedom seekers. People in the South, enslaved, who said, we will be free human beings, and they took off. And as they took off, people responded to them. And those people responding began to develop what we now call the Underground Railroad. So it starts with the freedom seekers, not the other way around. And then also, I want you to reframe it in terms of understanding the diversity of those involved. Were all kinds of families, all kinds of black families and white families. We have cycles of stories about the involvement of women in responding to freedom seekers. It was a very, very rich kind of response to people on the way to freedom. And it wasn't just the old white guys. It was their families and their wives and their children who were thinking about this. And consider for yourself the existential dilemma. Say you're a white family and you're on a farm in Northern Illinois someplace, and a family shows up on your doorstep and says, we've been walking a long time, could we sleep in your barn tonight? and you know those are escaped slaves. What would you do if somebody knocks on your door? Would you break the law? And what we discovered is that there were a number of people, black families and white families, confronted by the presence of enslaved folks on the run, who said, "My God, these people need help." And so they went. They responded to that, and they start to form what we know as the Underground Railroad. So it's really wants you to kind of think about all this stuff in a new way. Of course, the Underground Railroad was not underground. It was not a railroad. It was, in fact, this collection of all these journeys of freedom seekers, and in all the families out there, white families and black families and all kinds of people that responded to them and their journeys. And so, you know, I really invite you to carry that with you. Now, as we begin to look at all of this, I want to just remind everybody, it all starts with the brutal reality of slavery. And that what were people escaping from? It was enslavement. It was being treated as property. And this phenomenon, you know, this is, you know, you check out a horse, you check out a pig, and in the days of slavery, you checked out a slave, a piece of property. And if people are property, you do with them whatever you need to. And you love your dog, but when your dog gets incurably sick, you put it down. Okay. So if you have enslaved people in your household and you need to take care of them and they are working for you, but then you want to push them around or you want to rape them or do whatever, they are your property. And it's really hard for us to wrap our minds around that. That's the thing. The brutal reality of that is what people were escaping. And every once in a while, someone starts to talk about, well, some of the slaves didn't have it so bad. Don't buy it. Okay? Don't buy it. All right, now, where do people go? Most of us learned in school that the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and a bunch of people on the East Coast. In point of fact, we now know that more people escaped through Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio than ever escaped on the East Coast. So it's stories that we're coming to tell. Now, some went to Mexico, some to the Caribbean, some to live with indigenous folks in the West. The large number came into the northern states. And the other thing, two other things that are really interesting about the map. One is to realize that Cairo in southern Illinois is further south than most of the state of Virginia. Southern Illinois was really southern. And so when freedom seekers made their way to Illinois, it was still very tricky. They still had to travel at night. They still had to be super careful because it was very much southern. And you can see that Illinois is kind of like this dagger that points into the south. Another thing I like to remind people about with the map, the red states are the free states. This is 1850, California had just been admitted as a free state. All of the dark colored states are slave-owning states. When the Confederacy is formed and they secede and the Civil War begins, remember, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware did not secede. And part of the complexity about Abraham Lincoln as our president, he was the president of a union of free and slave states. You know, and we just, well, the Civil War was the North against the South, the free against the slave. It was a lot more complicated than that. So kind of bear some of that in mind. Now, my research suggests that more than 4,500 people made their way into Illinois, a lot coming out of Missouri and Kentucky, but also coming up the Mississippi River Valley. And there was a very rich culture all along the Mississippi River Valley, and very early on. In the 1830s, people got very clear that Chicago was a place of some sanctuary. And as things develop, people realize that they can either, some few stay in Chicago, but once they get into Northern Illinois, they realize to be free people, they've got to get to Canada. Because the great irony was, the only way to be free if you're black would be to leave the land of the free. And we now know that more than 2,500 people made their way into Chicago, and most of these folks were coming up the Mississippi River Valley on or next to near the Mississippi River, then up the Illinois River Valley, and then up into the Chicago region. And what I've been looking at are, I forgot about the arrows. There was a whole different pattern of people going in Indiana. A lot of times these things get confused, but there's an interesting set of geographic problems right in here. And so as people were coming north, they really were divided. You either went straight up Illinois or you went straight up Indiana, and there was very little movement across this kind of big geographic barrier. Okay, now my research over the last series, 20 years, has really looked at two great streams of movement. Freedom seekers that came up, then ended up coming up the Illinois River Valley and up into Chicago. A significant number went to and through Chicago, and then a significant number bypassed Chicago. And so those two streams are really important as we figure out, well, what happened here? I've identified more than 60 places in northern Illinois where we know that freedom seekers found assistance. And if you look at it, there is a, coming along the Illinois River Valley, there is a kind of pattern coming up here to Chicago, and there's another kind of pattern of sites that come straight east. And these, when you're in Chicago, you have to get back down around Lake Michigan. So I've got lots of evidence that there were these two great streams of movement. People coming into Chicago were coming up historic trails. They were coming up the I&M Canal. There were a few coming up trails from the direct south, but again, coming from the Mississippi River Valley. That second stream of movement was in the corridor of the Sauk Trail, which runs right across the bottom of Cook County. Now, on the I&M Canal in Lockport, have you been to the museum in Lockport? You want a great day trip, go to Lockport, because in this building is the Will County Historical Museum, and it's right next to the I&M Canal, which has been restored, and it's right next to a little state museum, and there's a restaurant right there in this historic building called Public Landings. It's really good. So you can have a whole day, you can go hiking up and down along the trail, and you can go to this building. This was built in 1836-37 as the administrative headquarters for the I&M Canal. And in the 1830s and 40s, this was the most important public building in northern Illinois. It was this little developing town. The real action was here. And I've worked very closely with the folks at the museum. And one of the things we've done is that we've gotten this recognized as an official Network to Freedom site. And the National Park Service, God bless the National Park Service. One of the great things they've done for the last 26 years is they've had a major nationwide underground railroad project. And it's called the Network to Freedom, and they're doing just really, really wonderful work. There are to date more than 700 places across the United States where we've done the full documentation that they were places where freedom seekers found assistance. And this place is one of them. I helped to write that application. And let me assure you, if something is on the Network to Freedom, it is real. The document's been done. There's no mythology. This really was part of that network of the Underground Railroad. So people were coming up into Chicago, and when they came up, there were, over time, this great network of response developed in the 1830s, and then at the end of the 1830s, a group of young white families settled in Chicago and got deeply involved. Because of that, they were confronted by freedom seekers coming to Chicago, and what are you going to do? You're going to break the law and help. So the small group of white families got really involved. By the middle of the 1840s, a small group of black families got involved. And by the 1850s, the black families were providing the real leadership for the Underground Railroad in Chicago. And again, all of the Illinois history and all the Chicago history talks about all the white people that ran it, and it wasn't. There was a remarkable coalition of black families and white families that were assisting freedom seekers.
I like to refer to it as the first great civil rights movement in Chicago, where a biracial coalition of folks were working seriously to make sure that people could find their way to freedom. And I always like to say a word about this fellow. This is Louis Isbell. Louis was enslaved in Kentucky. He got his freedom when he was about 18, and he moved to Chicago in 1838. And this absolutely remarkable person, coming out of his enslavement, comes to Chicago, becomes a barber, and Louis Isbell was involved in every significant thing that happened in the black community between 1838 and 1905. And nobody's ever heard of Louis Isbell. So again, remember, the people that write history may not always see all that needs to be seen in terms of understanding the history. The remarkable collection of black families that were running things were led by John and Mary Richardson Jones. They were the most prominent and the most wealthy black family in Chicago. John Jones was the first elected official, black elected official in Cook County. And they were assisted by a variety of other folks, including these other families. And there was a very, very developed process so that as freedom seekers made their way to Chicago, by the 1850s, there were people responding to those journeys. Remember that a large number, probably the overwhelming majority of people on their way to freedom were walking. And so can you imagine walking up out of the South, up the entire state of Illinois, and then finding assistance in Chicago. With all that black involvement, it really revolved around two great historic churches, both started as groups in the 1840s. And really, the Underground Railroad really develops around that. My colleague Tom and I are working closely with folks at Quinn Chapel downtown, and they are planning, they're doing a huge renovation, and they're planning to create an Underground Railroad museum in their basement. And over time, we're going to be working with them, and that becomes very much a part of their work. So then, these are a lot of the things I've kind of quickly summarized, a lot of the stuff I like to talk about. And then the question becomes, okay, Chicago and Lake Michigan. How do we begin to think about that? Because we know that a good number of people that made it to Chicago, they walked around the bottom of Lake Michigan in Detroit, but there are also a large number that got on lake steamers. And one of the really intriguing stories we have is about Sylvester Lind. Sylvester Lind was a great lumber baron in the 1840s and 50s. He really established Lake Forest, and Lake Forest College was originally Lind University. And then it changed to Lake Forest. So he was this really remarkable guy, and he had his lumberyard was right here on the south branch of the Sears Tower is like down here someplace. But it was there, and we have whole cycles of stories of white and black Underground Railroad folk directing freedom seekers to Lind's lumberyard. And he would hide them in the lumberyard, and then when they were loading up their lumber boats, they would just load some people into the bottom who were on their way to freedom, and then they would go up north and around, up north, up Lake Michigan, and then around and down through Lake Huron. Again, getting to Detroit, and access was right there to Canada. Now, the other great set of stories revolves around two particular captains. Captain Augustus Walker, who was the captain of the Great Western Lake Steamer, and Captain Chesley Blake. They were both committed abolitionists, and they both had varieties of ways and variety of connections with white abolitionists and black abolitionists to get people to the boats. And one of the things I ran into, a couple examples of this, one of the things that was really cool was, part of what's going on with enslavement is this whole phenomenon of race. When people saw black people, black-skinned people, they thought they were enslaved people. And lots of times, free black people were operating as laborers. And so these guys, of course, as lake steamers, they had these big boilers, they're steamers, and they had to load all of this wood. And so regularly, they would have these, a group of stevedores, or whatever you call them, mostly black guys, carrying wood onto the lake steamer and coming back and carrying more wood and coming back and carrying more wood. And so, you know, you'd have a couple dozen people doing that. So what they would do is that they would bring just, you know, feed the freedom seekers into the line. And so a guy or a kid or somebody would go in carrying wood, and then they just never came out. Which I thought was just a, you know, what a delicious way to, you know, to play on the phenomenon of race, because, you know, the slave catchers, we have stories about the slave catchers standing right there, and they didn't get it. That, you know, the people they were looking for just walked right past them, got on the boat, and never got off, and they just never saw it. So some really interesting things. But throughout the 1840s and the 1850s, with these two ships and with a couple others, there was regular transportation of enslaved people making it to Chicago, then going on around through the lake system. Getting, a lot of them went directly to Detroit, and others went to other ports along the coast of Canada. And of course, remember that everything east of Michigan, that's Canada, right? That's another country. You remember our friends, Canada. So now, the thing that I've been most involved with, that Tom and Lana and I have been involved with for years now, is some things that have gone on at the south edge of the city. And they relate very much to the historic road from Chicago to Detroit and Freedom in Canada. And that road, remember, Chicago was a tiny town, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 people, about the size of the Loop. And so Chicago is not at the bottom of Lake Michigan. Chicago's up a bit. And so freedom seekers making it to Chicago then had to walk 15 miles due south to get down around the bottom of Lake Michigan to get to Detroit and Freedom in Canada. And we've been involved for years in understanding this movement and the people that helped. And the remarkable folks that helped were in two Dutch settlements. What we know as the community of Roseland was a Dutch settlement, and what we know as the community of South Holland was a Dutch settlement. The name gives it away. But and there were other Dutch farmers along that route. And what we got really intrigued by was that we had found and were working on real evidence of particularly two families. One that had lived on this historic road up near Roseland, and another that lived right on the Little Calumet River. And so now we move into another kind of set of water stories, if you will. So these communities down in the Lake Calumet area, the two families were the family of Cornelius and Marche Kuiper and Jan and Angie Tung. They spoke English, and most of the Dutch folk did not. And so normally, naturally, kind of over time, as freedom seekers were coming south out of Chicago, and maybe they were hoping to get some food or need directions, they wanted a place to sleep for the night, and the Dutch farmers couldn't really talk to them, but they would direct them to either the Kuipers or the Tungs. And so these two families really end up being the kind of community leaders, and we've done a lot of work, particularly with the activities of Jan and Angie Tung. They bought a farm. They built a farm on the north branch of the Little Calumet River. This is what it looked like. The house is gone now, but we've got a real interesting cycle of stories about the Dutch involvement in responding to freedom seekers that were on their way to Detroit out of Chicago. We've done the deep research, and this is also on the National Park Service Network to Freedom, and we have really had a load of fun with it. We do tours every summer, every spring and summer. This morning, we took a group on large canoes that carried 8 to 10 people, and we went up the Little Calumet River, the Cal-Sag Channel, telling them Underground Railroad stories. In 2022, we put in historic marker, and you may recognize some of the people. On the left, Julia Stratton, the lieutenant governor. Next to her is Ron Gaines. Ron and his family are the ones that have built, that have taken this historic black marina, which is right on the Ton Farm land, and is reconditioning and has worked very closely with us on the history of the Ton Farm. To the right is Congresswoman Robin Kelly. Next to her, Cook County Commissioner Donna Miller, and then my friend and colleague Tom is on the far right. The fellow with the glasses in the back is the Consul General for the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Chicago. And the Dutch are really, really excited to know that there were Dutch immigrants that were helping, and so much so that last spring, the Dutch ambassador to the United States made a special visit with us. And the woman, the picture on the right, the woman standing on the right, is the ambassador from the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the United States. And they came, and we are in the process of erecting this year 2 signs, and the sign she's standing next to it, half of it is in Dutch and half of it is in English. So that's all kind of cool. But our work has been there, but reminding you that the key thing is, as freedom seekers were leaving Chicago, people responded. And among those people who responded were these Dutch immigrants. Now that's that first stream, people going to and through Chicago. And then there is that second stream, which is people that came straight across and bypassed Chicago. For the most part, they were following the historic Sauk Trail. This is a Native American trail that has developed over the last 300 or 400 years and has been used for all kinds of reasons. In the Gold Rush days, it was a real corridor for people going west to the great open west. But as freedom seekers came up to the Chicago area, there were a number of them bypassed Chicago because of slave catchers or because of the weather or any number of reasons, but a significant number, roughly 2,000 freedom seekers made it into Chicago and then left either by lake or walking. Roughly 1,000 freedom seekers came on this second corridor, coming across Illinois and then continuing directly into Michigan. Now, right next to the Sauk Trail, down at the just below the south edge of Cook County, is the village of Crete, Illinois. And this little congregational church was built in 1853, was organized by Congregationalists who had gotten themselves together in 1839. And for some reason, I believe it's because they were facing freedom seekers on the Sauk Trail. But for whatever reason, they got very involved very early. And in 1841, this was one of the very first churches in Illinois that issued an anti-slavery resolution. That building is now owned by the local historical society, and they're rehabbing it, and we're going to have a permanent Underground Railroad exhibit there. And right next to it is a cemetery, and both the church and the cemetery are on the network to freedom. So we have those 2 streams of movement, to and through Chicago and bypassing Chicago. But as they went across northwest Indiana and into Michigan, where did they go? And that has become a really powerful question for us. Where did they go? And Tom and Lana, and we've got a whole bunch of folks working with us on trying to find out, where exactly did people go? And we have, to begin with, have identified about 35 places where we have very good evidence of freedom seekers traveling through. And you will note that a number of these are right along the bottom of Lake Michigan. And then going over through northwest Indiana and into Michigan. And so what we are working on, and we would be delighted if any of you want to get involved in Underground Railroad research, or if you live in northwest Indiana, we want to talk to you. What we are developing over the next several years is what we're calling the Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail, to commemorate the journeys of all these freedom seekers and all of these places, these 35 places where they found assistance. That lower group of arrows that's the old Sauk Trail. So we've got a lot of folks all the way across broadly across southern Michigan. So it starts, we have two routes. One route starts in Chicago, the other starts down in Park Forest on the Sauk Trail, and then goes down to the Creek Museum, and then up, and then the two of those meet in Indiana and go on into northern Michigan. So as we're starting to work with people in Northwest Indiana, there have been some interesting things we've found. Some of you are aware of the controversy around what has been called the Alpha Rec or the Briggs Project, and there's an intriguing set of stories about freedom seekers being on a lake steamer and they being attacked by slave catchers, and we don't know if that story is even accurate, but we've got to do a lot more digging. The Historical Society in Ogden Dunes in Northwest Indiana have got loads of pieces of timber in their museum, which is all from this wreck. And they really want to have an Underground Railroad story connected to it. And we would like to work closely with those folks. And we have dozens and dozens of projects like that we'd like to dig into. However, there's a whole set of communities, Gary, Miller Beach, Ogden Dunes, Crispin, Chesterton's a little bit away from the lake, Tremont, close to the lake, that we really believe there was a significant interaction between lake steamers that traveled along the bottom of Lake Michigan and these abolitionist people living in that environment. Particularly interesting is there's an interesting cluster of white abolitionist families in Michigan City, and we think, and we need to do the research, but we think that they were deeply involved both with freedom seekers coming to Michigan City on lake steamers, and then later in the late 1850s, coming to Michigan City on the railroads. And of course, Michigan City was right on the historic Chicago to Detroit Freedom Trail. And so we know that a lot of people went through there. There's an interesting cycle of stories about the Lowe family that lived a couple miles away from the lake. So now, I want to turn to a couple stories. And whenever we talk about freedom seekers, wherever you really get into this, there are remarkable stories. And there is that question of, people end up traveling and traveling, and why are they here on the coast of Lake Michigan? Why are they here in Chicago? Why is this?
Oh,
in about 1857, a young man I'm going to call James Anderson had been enslaved in eastern Arkansas, and he'd made his way to Chicago. And he was able to get, in one way or another, it may have been with the firewood line thing, but James got onto the ship run by Captain Walker, the Great Western. And they hit him down in the hole. And ironically, on this particular trip, a group of very wealthy southern plantation owners and their families were on the lake steamer, up in the staterooms, up in the top. And so James is down in the basement, or not the basement, what do they call it? The hole, thank you. Now, you guys are shit guys, people. The hole, so James is down there in the hole. And they make their way up, they're going up through Lake Michigan, and they get up around the top of Lake Michigan. And one evening, the captain, who of course is with all his passengers, and one evening, one of his ship people, one of his crew comes up and whispers something in his ear, and the captain is doesn't know what to do, and he says something back, and then he gets everyone's attention, stands up, and he says, "It has come to my attention that there is a fugitive slave in the hold, and I'm not going to have that on my steamship. And the first opportunity I have, I will kick him off of this boat." And everybody said, "Well, terrific, that's what they deserve, those kind of people." And the Southerners didn't quite realize it, but the next morning they pull up to shore, and the captain makes a big deal of everyone comes out, and they drag James out of the hold, and they take him, and he says, "You gotta get off my ship," and for extra effort, gives him a little kick, and James stumbles down the gangplank, and of course the captain had kicked him in the calf. I've always loved that. What a wonderful, wonderful way to get at it. Lana, come back up. All of our stories, so many of our stories, not only about Lake Michigan, but about involve rivers and lakes and all kinds of movement. And so we'd like to share with you a water song, and you are invited to join in.
Yes, you're invited. That means you have to sing. He put it nicely. I was not going to put it that nicely. Okay. We talked about water. There's a lot of things with water in terms of slaves running away. Water, if you go through the water, then that's supposed to take the sin of the dogs off of you. There's also the spiritual context of water, of God troubling the water, wading in the water. We're going to sing the song "Wade in the Water" is what we're going to sing. God troubling the water in, and leading Moses, was parting the water, and leading Moses, leading the Egyptians. You know what I'm trying to say, okay, I'm sorry.
Parting the water.
Okay.
Parting the water, all those things, all those
What I say, leading the water, what I say, parting the water. Okay, so that's kind of what the wade in the water is. And we're all going to sing. I'm going to be watching. If you're not singing, I'm going to point to you. Point you out. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to sing "Wade in the Water," and whenever, I'm going to do 2 verses, and whenever we come to the refrain, then everybody must sing. Okay? Okay. Any questions?
No.
All right.
What are the words?
Here we go.
Wade. Let me take it. No, I'll go one lower. Wade in. I don't want to sing too high because I can't sing that high. I'm sorry. Oh, start again. Okay. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Here you go. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Worse. See that band all dressed in white. God's gonna trouble the water. Looks like the band of Israelites. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. See that band all dressed in red? God's gonna trouble the water. It must be the band that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade, wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade again, wade in the water. Clap your waters. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. One more time. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. God's gonna trouble the water again. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble. God's gonna trouble. God's gonna trouble the water.
I think this is the best singing group we've had in a long time. You guys are just terrific. You're just terrific. Okay, next story. Now about a freedom seeker, but someone that helped freedom seekers. A guy named Jonathan Walker, and he was a fishing boat captain out of Massachusetts. And in the 1830s, he was fishing up and down the East Coast, and then he ended up in the Gulf of Mexico. And turns out he was a real abolitionist. And so some of the very early folks that were involved in the movement against slavery in the South and trying to rescue people, and was this guy, Jonathan Walker, ends up working with them in the 1830s, a very early involvement. And then he moves to Florida, and he's fishing off of Florida, based in Pensacola, and in 1844, he is arrested. There is a particular group of 7 freedom seekers had been hiding in the woods, and they came and they sought out Jonathan Walker and asked for his help to get him up, maybe up even to New England. And so he was trying to help them, and the sheriffs closed in and recaptured the freedom seekers, and they captured Jonathan Walker. And he was taken to court in Pennsylvania, in Pensacola, in 1844. And the only time this happened, but the court decided that he had to pay a fine, but also he would be identified as a slave stealer. And so in public court, they held his hand, and they burned into his hand an SS for slave stealers. And it's, can you imagine, having that in public court? It was devastating for him. He returned home and began to tell his stories. And people began to be really intrigued by the story, and they started to refer to him on the anti-slavery circuit as the man with the branded hand. And he went all over New York and New England giving anti-slavery lectures. And then the really fascinating twist for this is that he retires to Muskegon, Michigan, right after the Civil War. And so his story comes with him. And so there on the shores of Lake Michigan, this guy who had been branded in Pensacola and given lectures for years in New York and New England ends up settling on Lake Michigan. And if you go up to Muskegon today and go to the cemetery, you will find his monument with engraved on the monument is the hand. You know, I mean, I just when I started working for you all for the two maritime museums, I found this story. I thought, isn't that remarkable? This fishing captain who ends up here on Lake Michigan. And if you will indulge me for a minute, in 1845, John Greenleaf Whittier, who was a very strong anti-slavery guy, decided that he needed to write a poem about the man with the branded hand. And near its close, he writes, "Then lift that manly right hand, bold plowman of the wave. Its branded palm shall prophesy salvation to the slave. Hold up its fire-wrought language, that those who reads it may feel his heart swells strong within him, his suins change to steel. Hold it up before our sunshine, up against our northern air. Yo, men of Massachusetts, for the love of God, look there. Take it henceforth for your standard, like the Bruce's heart of yore. In the dark strife closing round thee, let that hand be seen before." I think it's just great. It's just great. And can you imagine, these anti-slavery meetings, and they would have, they'd have the church choir sing song, and then this guy gets up and gives this impassioned speech, and it shows his hand to everybody, and then somebody gets up and recites, Whittier's poem. The place would have gone crazy. Okay, two more stories, and we'll finish for the evening. First of all, I want to tell you about Henry Stevens. Henry Stevens, brilliant guy. Henry was the old man living in Canada. Henry was enslaved on a farm in central Missouri. And in the next door farm, two dear friends of his, named Anthony and Martha, were married. They were enslaved. They were married. And they decided to have a life together. They needed to escape. And so they ran. And from central Missouri, they ran, and they were heading for freedom. Their owner came over the owner hired a slave catcher. I love it. The slave catcher's name was Uriah Hinch. Isn't that a great slave catcher name? So the guy that owned Martha and Anthony hires Uriah Hinch, and he goes to his neighbor and he says, Henry is a really smart guy. Could I just take Henry with us? Because what Uriah said was, as we go to towns, if we had a good black slave, they could talk to the black people, and we'll talk to the sheriff and everybody else. And so Henry's owner says, sure. So they take off. The owner of Martha and Anthony, and Uriah Hinch, the slave catcher, and Henry Stevenson. And they head east across Missouri. They cross the Mississippi, and they head east, finally getting near Peoria. And every settlement of any kind that they have, they stop, and the two white guys, they go and talk to the sheriff and other people. And Henry, of course, you go talk to the black people. And so Henry goes and talks, and about every other place they go, they come back, and Henry says, I got real news. Anthony and Martha have been here. They're going to Chicago. And the white guys, wow, isn't that terrific? Henry found this out. They get to Peoria, and they talk to him. He goes to the white guys go to the boat captains and the sheriff, and we're looking for these couple, and describes them. And Henry goes and talks to the black people. And they get together, and Henry comes back and he said, guess what? They've been here. Henry and Martha and Anthony were here. They're going to Chicago. And so they get on a river steamer, and they go up the Illinois River. They get up to Ottawa, and they talk to people in Ottawa. The same thing happens. they talk to the white people, and Henry comes like, they've been here. And they get on the I&M Canal, and they're coming from Ottawa up on the I&M Canal, and Henry, who loved the canal locks, he'd get up on the deck, and at one lock, the boat is kind of going through the lock and all that, and there are these Irish workmen on the bank, and they're looking at this black guy on the boat. And these Irish guys come and says, hey, this is Northern Illinois. You can be free. Run away. And Henry says, no, I'm working. My master wants me to be working for these guys. I'm working for these guys. And so, of course, the white guys hear this, and my God, Henry's terrific. And, he really knows how to be a slave. And so they get up, and they would have come right near here. Where was the end of the canal, the final part? Was it right out here someplace, people?
Right down where it meets the river.
Yeah, okay, it was right.
Basin.
Okay, so the turning basin was, down there's a way. But it was really close to where you are. The canal boat comes and stops, and Henry just says, okay, why don't you just relax? Chicago's a good place. I'll go talk to the black people in Chicago, and we'll find out where Mark and Henry. And of course, Martha and Anthony, of course, the two white guys, wow, God, isn't he terrific? What a good sight. And so Henry walks off the canal boat, and he gets up, and there's a wagon, a freight wagon, loading up stuff to take into Chicago. And there's a black guy up, black teamster up on the top. And Henry says, are you going into Chicago? And I says, yeah, come on. So he climbs up next to him on the freight wagon, and they take off to get into the center of Chicago. And the guy turns to him and says, are you slave? And Henry says, well, yeah. And he says, well, don't you want to be free? And Henry says, of course I do. And the guy says, I've got people that can help. So they get into Chicago. The driver drops them off at the home of some of the black abolitionists. And the black abolitionists are really glad to welcome Henry. And they said, we can get you on a lake steamer tonight. There's one going out that we can get you on. But we're really short on money right now. We'll have to go run and collect money. Henry says, I can get some money. And so Henry goes back, gets another ride back to the canal basin, gets back on and says, guess what? I found Anthony and Martha. We're going to be able to get them. And the white guy's delighted, and the white guy says, and Henry says, but it's going to cost us some money. You understand that. Of course, this is not going to happen. I got to pay off some people. And so the two white guys, the owner and Uriah Hinch, are delighted, and they fork over a bunch of money to Henry, and Henry says, great, I'll be right back. And he gets on another wagon back to Chicago, and that evening they buy his ticket and they put him on a boat to freedom.
And what happened to the other couple, do we know?
Well, as far as we know, they make it to freedom. We do not hear about them again, but because Henry ends up living in Windsor, Ontario, right across from Detroit, and is a part of a group of freedom seekers that settle there. And we think he would have known what happened to them, but in his records and in the memoirs he left, he doesn't say anything. So I assume that Martha and Anthony, found their way to freedom. Okay, can I have another 5 minutes? Okay, if I do one more song and one more story, and then maybe you want to have some questions. And so Lana is, where are you, my dear? Okay, great. If we could do Child, I'm Tired.
You're tired, child. You've been running, you've been hiding, you're trying to become free. You're running for your freedom. Your relatives are running for your freedom. Your family, your friends, but you're free. You've gotten to a point where you're free. Sit down, child, and rest a little while. Sit down, sister, sit down. I know you're tired. Sit down, 'cause you've come a long way. Sit down, child. Sit down and rest a little while. Oh, sit down.
rested a while, oh, you come a long way. And the road was dark, and you had hard trials. Sit down, child, sit down and rest a little while, for you come a long way. And the road was dark, and I know you're tired. Sit down, child, sit down and rest a little while. Sister, what you waiting for? Oh, you're waiting for your mama. She's a-running for her freedom. Sit down, child, sit down and rest a little while. Brother, what you waiting for? Oh, you're waiting on your neighbor. He's a-running for his freedom. Sit down, child, sit down and rest a little while. Oh, sit down, children, sit down. I know you're tired. Sit down, 'cause you've come a long way. Sit down, child, sit down and rest a little while. Oh, you've come a long way. And you had hard trials, and I know you're tired. Sit down, child, sit down and rest, 'cause you are free. You're free. You're free. You're free.
Say free.
Say free. I'm free. I'm free. I'm free.
Yeah.
Sit down.
And now sit down, Tom. In 1841, John and Eliza Little were enslaved on adjoining farms in western Tennessee. John had had a difficult life. They were in their late 20s, but already his life had been difficult. He was born in Virginia. His parents were among the last Africans brought in chains from Africa to our country. And all of his life, John was very clear. He said to people when they asked, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am the son of African princes." Now, needless to say, that caused troubles along the way. John had great scars on his back and a bullet fragment in his shoulder. And he ended up being sold from the farm in Virginia to one in Kentucky, and then to this farmer in western Tennessee. In the neighboring farm, Eliza lived, and Eliza and John eventually met and fell in love and got married. And after a while, they decided if they're going to have any kind of life together, they needed to be free. They had to escape. So in the spring of 1841, they decided this is the time to go. And so John and Eliza packed up some small satchels and they took off. And for those of you that know the rivers of America really well, you may recognize that in western Tennessee and Kentucky, the Tennessee River flows north. You know, most American rivers kind of flow south, but the Tennessee River in western Tennessee and western Kentucky flows north, about 200 miles. So John and Eliza get to the Tennessee River, and they know, they've talked to a lot of people, they know that if they get up the Tennessee River, they can cross the Ohio and they can get into Illinois, which is a free state. So they get to the Tennessee River, and they're following along the banks, and as they get close to the Ohio River, they run into a big swampy area. And years later, John told some of his friends, he said, I found a floating log, and I put Eliza on the log, and I put everything that we owned, our satchels, I put them behind Eliza. And I knew that it was going to be tough to push her through the swamp. And if I misstepped, I would lose everything I loved. And John did not misstep. And he was able to push that log through the swamp. And they got to the Ohio River. And they borrowed a boat to get across the river. And they'd been walking for weeks. And they're on the north side of the Ohio River. They're in Illinois. And they build a little campfire and kind of sit down. We're tired. Let's rest a little while. And they're sitting there, and it just so happens that some other freedom seekers
had crossed at about the same time, saw their fire. And they came over and were talking to John and Eliza. And these other people were really discouraged. And they said, you know, Cairo is just a couple miles from here. If we go over to Cairo and turn ourselves in, they could take us back to our masters, and maybe, you know, maybe they wouldn't really punish us. Maybe it would be okay if we turned ourselves in. And in the midst of that, Eliza stood up at that fire and she looked at them and she said, I know where we have been and I know where I must go, and if needs be, I will walk barefoot to Chicago for my freedom. John and Eliza Little walked 370 miles to get to Chicago. 200 miles to get to the Ohio River, 370 miles on their own through Illinois to Chicago. They immediately connected with some black abolitionists who got them on a lake steamer, and they took off up Lake Michigan and made their way to Detroit and then Canada, and we have got very good records. They had a really, really good life. But can you imagine the struggle for people? Can you imagine what it would be to walk hundreds and hundreds of miles? What it would be to walk at night because you couldn't trust the daylight? So, brothers and sisters, carry our stories and our music and remember this remarkable part of our common history, of these remarkable folks that found the ways, the courage, the tenacity, whatever, to get to freedom, and the remarkable folks that broke the law to help them out. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Okay, right here in the front. Okay.
In history, slavery. What was different between Canada and the northern states? Was there still some legal allowance for I'm trying to think of the right word for hunters to come and try to.
Oh, I got you. I know where you're going with this. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. From the beginning of the country, there was a Fugitive Slave Act, and you were required anywhere in the country to help slave catchers that were looking for people. But in a sense, it really didn't matter. I mean, nobody really followed that law very well. In a number of states, they didn't want to follow that law. However, it was on the books, and in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, which is probably the most horrendous piece of federal legislation ever passed, made it essentially mandatory. If you were a law enforcement person and slave catchers needed your help, you had to help them. And if you were a citizen and you helped a freedom seeker, you could be fined $1,000. That's $20,000 in today's money, okay? I mean, it was really serious business. And so there were both slave catchers out of the South, and there were also organized kidnapping bands and slave catcher groups in the northern states. And why then, in places like Chicago, the black population and the anti-slavery population was strong enough that they could have relatively safe. So there are a number of people who enslaved stayed in Chicago, but most had to get to Canada because that was the only way they could be securing their freedom. After 1837, the Canadian government said, any person that steps a foot on the Queen's dominions, Queen of Victoria, anyone sets 1 foot on the Queen's dominions, they are a free person. And so it was really clear, you get into Canada, you are free. No questions about it. Of course, there were vigilante gangs that would cross from Detroit and try to capture people, but it was stunningly clear to everybody that if you were in Canada, full stop, freedom. If you're anywhere else in this country, who knows?
It, was a very dramatic, different.
No, thank you, that makes a lot of
Does that
sense.
helps?
Yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the question I had was, were any of those branches of groups of people moving east go through the northern part of Ohio? And the reason I ask is that we have a friend who owns a long old inn in outside of Cleveland. And the story that goes with that inn is that it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And I'm wondering if you're aware of one of those streams that went.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. If you take what I told you about Illinois, the dynamics are different, but there's a similar stream that goes up through Indiana, and a stream that goes up through Ohio, and a stream that goes from Virginia up into Pennsylvania, and then there's the East Coast stream, which is, Virginia and Maryland going up into Pennsylvania, New York, and all. So there are these streams. We have, a number of us use a basic kind of evaluation category that says we have verifiable sites. We've got all kinds of evidence. Freedom seekers are really good. We have potential sites. No, we have probable sites. Probable sites are, we've got pretty good evidence, but we can't quite nail it down. And then there are potential sites. And the potential sites are basically, well, there's folklore about this. There are stories about this. And there are places like the inn you're talking about. It might be just in that category. It's just a great story. Maybe they've got some real evidence, so it's probable, or maybe they really can nail it, and they've got very strong evidence. But to get into the network of freedom, you've got to be in that verifiable category. And places, remember that at the end of the 19th century, people look back in the North, people look back on the Civil War as this remarkable experiment and success. And many people in their family, they were abolitionists. And at the end of the 19th century, many, many people whose grandparents or parents had been abolitionists, who might have had some contact with a fugitive, all of a sudden they're part of the Underground Railroad. And so there are loads of places. I mean, I've had to, as gracefully as I can, I've had to debunk about 15 places in Chicago, because the stories are great, but
You can't verify.
there's no evidence. And so we say, that's a great potential. Terrific, we love you, we'll keep you in the list. But that's a potential, it's not probable, it's not verified. Any other questions? Yeah.
So where does people end up in Canada? You said Windsor for some families.
Yeah, in Southwest Ontario, directly across from Detroit, there were a number of people settled. There are 7 predominantly Canadian African, when we say African Canadian communities. And those are all folks that are descendants of freedom seekers. So there are those 7 communities, and if you ever get there, if our passports are still useful, if you can get into Canada, those communities are various to visit. They have several really good museums. Now, to your point about there were people, a lot of the folks coming out of Ohio went across Lake Erie into that southern part of Ontario. Another great crossing point was Buffalo and Niagara Falls. And there were a huge number of folks that went across there. And so kind of near Toronto, there's another set of predominantly African Canadian communities which are descendants. And then there are a couple other places, but they're the two there's the kind of Buffalo point and the Detroit point, are the 2 kind of points of entry. Yeah.
What was the border security like back then? I know you mentioned the Queen. Was there a means of enforcing people's freedom?
Say what?
Why don't you turn your screen on? So.
Oh, that's right. That's what. Well, no, okay. Hang on just a second.
Or go to a map.
Yeah. Well, I'll just do something else. All right. I'm not going to. I'll stand over here. There we go. I'll stand here out of the way. In terms of border security, it was my sense is that the border was very real, and in terms of things like this, government officials, sheriffs, and so on, US Marshals, they understood they could not cross the border. But there was no real guarding of it. And so we've got an interesting cycle of stories of vigilantes, American vigilante groups that have crossed the border into Canada looking for specific freedom seekers to kidnap and take back. But I'm not aware of there being, at this time, of course, much earlier there were, when the French and the English were involved, there were lots of forts and stuff. But in the 1840s and 50s, it was a pretty porous border. Yeah.
Now, I know you touched it briefly, but how did the appellation of Underground Railroad come to be called this Freedom Trail?
Why was it called the Underground Railroad? There is a great story that has just been uncovered. All of us have carried a traditional story that proves not to be true. The great story, I will tell you, real quickly. There was a black journalist in the 1830s and 40s, lived in Washington, D.C., and he wrote satirical columns for all the small black newspapers on the East Coast. And he had been enslaved in Virginia and had made his way to freedom and had bought his freedom. Really bright guy, and you could still read his newspaper columns. So anyways, Thomas Smallwood really has an in for slave owners. And again and again in his newspaper columns, he talks about how stupid the slave owners are. And one time, and remember that railroads were the kind of technological rage that, the 1830s, 1840s, railroads were, busting out all over the place. So anyway, Smallwood writes an article, and it just, those slave owners are so dumb that they don't understand how we have organized. We have a fleet of hot air balloons, and we float them over Virginia, and we drop down ropes, and the slaves scamper up the ropes, and we bring them to freedom. And they have no idea that we have dug this remarkable underground railroad, and it goes all from Virginia, and the slaves know where the stations are, and they come down the railroad, and we bring them to freedom. And that shows how stupid they are. Well, that column was carried in a number of black newspapers, then some of the abolitionists newspapers, and people loved the image. And because railroads were the thing, they said, wow, what a great idea. Let's pick up this language, let's call it the Underground Railroad. That's what we're doing. And I initially was skeptical of the story, and then I did deep research in a whole bunch of, some people are weird and do this kind of research. I did a whole bunch of research into Midwest newspapers in the early 1840s. That's what I do, those kind of things. So anyway, I'm digging in there, and lo and behold, the references in the Midwest to the Underground Railroad all come in the summer and in the fall of 1844. And he publishes that column in August of 1842. It's passed, and all these newspapers traded stuff all the time. And so between August of 1842, it was passed in all these newspapers, and finally it reaches into the Midwest. And that's where the language for us comes from, when it finally percolated into Illinois. But I just think I just love that story.
What was the writer's name?
The guy was Thomas Smallwood. And there's the guy that found this, there's a reporter from the New York Times, and he took a sabbatical and was doing research, and he put all this together. I think his book is called Flee North. But anyways, it's a lovely book. And of course, the guy that wrote it, as a reporter, really connected with Smallwood because he was also a journalist. But I think that's a great thing. So anyway, it is about 8:15 or something like that, and we'll take one more question.
Once they made it to Canada, was there a path to citizenship, or how did that work? Did they only have to become a citizen of Canada?
I really don't know the details on that, except remember there was a day when you know, when you settle in the United States, you settle. When you settle in Canada, you settle. And eventually people got around to becoming citizens, but that was not any kind of issue in Nebraska in the 1840s.
Okay.
And no kind of issue. So there eventually, my hunch is that the little bit I know about the Canadian systems is that probably when people settled and then started having families and had to get their kids in school, that's probably when they started to formalize those relationships. Yeah, but it was, again, it was a very, very open kind of thing. So again, a delight to be with you, and I do have books for sale. My big book, Onward to Chicago, $25 American, and we think we can take credit cards, but we never know for sure. And the other little book is The Underground Railroad South of Chicago, and that's where I talk about really all the activities across the southern tier, that southern stream. And then the other book is the story of Caroline Quarles, a remarkable young woman who at age 16, she was the daughter of her master's son, beautiful young woman, freckles, blue eyes, long black hair, could pass as white, and she was enslaved in a house with her three cousins. And finally, at age 16, she'd had enough, and she traveled from St. Louis 1,200 miles for her freedom. And we know a lot about her story. So it's Caroline's story, the Underground Railroad details, and then the big picture, and all my stories are in the big blue book. So again, great to be with you all, and please, my colleague Tom Shepard is here, and we would love, if you'd like to keep up with us, to get your email. We'll put you on an email list. We have copies of our brochure, and take that, and it has Tom's email and my email. And
who's our talented vocalist?
And I was going to talk again. I'm just going to say, and particular appreciation to Lana Lewis. Lana has been very much a part of all that we've been doing, and again, because of that remarkable music, let's give her another. So please talk to us for more info, and we have tours that we do down at the Little Calumet River, and you can be in touch with us to find out about those things. So we will carry on. Okay, good to be with you all.
Thank you.